If you were here last Sunday, you're kind of on track with us that I had an ambitious sermon planned, and God said, I don't think so, Duane. And so we got through about half of the sermon last week. So if you're nervous about how late it is already, let me just allay your fears. We've got everything under control. Everything's going according to schedule. We're going to look at James 4, and we're actually just going to look at 5 verses just to kind of finish the thought that we started last Sunday. In your handout, I filled out the part that we talked about last Sunday, and we're going to look at James 4, 6 to 10. Last Sunday, we talked about worldliness, and a lot of times that worldliness is defined by the places you go, or the way you dress, or the way you look, or the friends that you have. It's defined by externals a lot of times. But James specifically narrows in on the internals, that worldliness is not defined by things outside of us. Worldliness is defined by what's inside of us. So you can look like a fantastic, perfect Christian and be just as worldly as anyone else. Specifically, we defined it as selfishness and pride. Selfishness and pride seem to be what James is narrowing in on when he talks about the adulterous people who are friends with the world and enemies of God. And so I asked you to spend some time this week evaluating, thinking through your own life of who am I really serving? What am I really doing spiritually? Let me go over a list of so far. James has not had any problem stepping on our toes. I've been preaching, as we've been preaching through, this is, I think, sermon number 7. And I've literally felt like, man, I really am ready to preach some good news. I'm ready to preach a happy sermon where I can encourage people. But James just keeps bringing us back to this is what's wrong and this is what's wrong. Let me remind you of some of those. In chapter 1, he warned us about wavering faith. He warned us about having a lack of love. In chapter 2, he warned us about showing partiality or preference in the church. He warned us about having a dead faith or a worthless religion. He warned us about having an untamed tongue or not controlling our tongue. He warned us about hearing the word and not doing it, the hypocrisy that's so prevalent in church. He warned us about selfish ambition. He warned us about discontentment. He warned us about attacking condemnation. He warned us about arrogant boasting. He warns us about shallow prayers. He warns us about, I'm not done yet. He warns us about fights and quarrels. He warns us about selfishness and pride. And if you get through that whole list, and spiritually, as you're doing inventory, if you're just like check in the good way of, okay, I'm good to go. Thanks, James, but I appreciate your warnings, but I'm all right. Spiritually, I'm okay. You're missing the point of James, and I would go so far to say you probably have more spiritual problems than you have any idea of. That's where I found myself in Bible college. I went to Bible college. I grew up as a pastor's son. I knew the answers. I grew up in Awana. I knew Bible verses. I knew theology. I was reading, I don't know if you know the name John MacArthur, but he writes these theological books. 12, 13-year-olds, I was reading books by John MacArthur and debating with my friends in high school election and free will and all of these things. That was my hobby. That was what I was interested in. And it sounds like I'm bragging, but hold on, okay? So then from about like 8 years old, I knew that I wanted to be a pastor. So I pursued Bible college. I went to Bible college. Have you ever heard there's a quote, in my mind it's by Moody, but I'm not sure exactly who it's from. The quote is, "The world has yet to see what a man fully devoted to God can do," or something along those lines. And someone told me that as a young boy, and my thought was, well, they're gonna see. I'm gonna be that man who is fully devoted to God. I'm going to do it. I'm going to devote my life, devote my heart to God. And the thing is, as you say those kind of things as a young man, people around you get really excited. No one says, whoa, that's self-righteousness. Everyone says, that's wonderful, because it's exciting to see a young person memorizing Bible verses and talking theology and talking about devoting his life and being a pastor. So in love and in care, my parents were stoking that flame of, yes, Duane, that's the direction you need to go. So I get to Bible college, and what I didn't realize was growing inside of me was this hideous, disgusting, self-righteous pride, where I had a mentality of, I'm doing this for God. God is lucky to have me because I'm going to turn the world upside down for him. Do you hear that language? What I'm going to do for God. What God gets from me. And I can specifically remember my freshman year in college. We had a dual level library, and I was downstairs in the library in this little studying cubby. And I don't even remember what I was reading, but all of a sudden, it was like brick by brick, God began to show me and tear down my own righteousness, all the confidence and pride I had in what I was going to do for God and what I had to offer God. And behind that veneer of perfect righteousness was this corrupt pride. There was a song that I remember that said, I'm driven by rivers of pride. And it felt like all of a sudden I saw the filth that was flowing through me behind this beautiful picture of doing everything right and being this good boy that everyone was so proud of. And it broke my heart. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I was qualified to be a pastor, if there was anything I actually had to offer to God, that I was so focused on who I was and what I had, that I began to think, there's nothing that I have to offer God. And so I can point back to a time where James 4, 6-10, these verses, would you read these with me as I read them out loud? James 4, 6 says, he gives more grace, therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched, and mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. That was the experience I had of being wretched and poor and turning my joy into gloom, turning my laughter into mourning. But what I've since discovered is that this is not a one-time experience that Christians are supposed to have. I've discovered this is what it means to be a Christian. This kind of a posture before God, of being humble before God, and of submitting to God, is not something you do one time and then God says, oh good, now I'll pour my grace out on you, you're good to go. But this is a repeated process that God continually brings me back to. And I believe for a Christian, this is the lifeblood of a Christian, humbling ourselves before the Lord. Pride is the cancer of Christianity. Self-righteousness kills the flame of the Holy Spirit. It kills the flame of what God wants to do inside of us. So constantly we're brought back to this position. When's the last time you kneeled on your knees before God? We as Americans, we're so independent and we're so proud that even kneeling down on our knees is foreign to us. It's uncomfortable for us, physically and emotionally. We resist bending our knees. We resist bending our wills. We are a democracy. We have a voice. We have a say in everything we're a part of, except for Christianity. It is not a democracy. You're not invited to vote. You're not invited to be part of the decision-making process. You submit. You humble yourself. That's the nature of Christianity. So I want to look at what this means. In your notes, if you could write, these verses are the heart of James's letter. I was reading through a commentary by Douglas Moo, a fantastic commentary called The Pillar Commentary of the New Testament. And he said, if there's a heart of the New Testament, if there's a heart of the book of James, because a lot of people just see it as a random, talks about this and talks about that. So these verses are the heart of the letter of James. And that caught me. Because there's so much that it seems like James is saying, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong. And here James says, this is the answer. This is what you need to be doing. This is what I'm calling you to. The first thing he calls us to is to humble ourselves before the Lord. Number one, humble yourselves before the Lord. What does that mean? What does that look like to humble ourselves? First, be honest about your sin, be serious about your sin, and mourn over your sin. I talked last week about the pastor in the States who refuses to acknowledge, refuses to talk about the concept of sin. Sin is not something that we are comfortable with. It is not something that psychiatrists and psychologists want us to think about anymore. It's constantly positive thinking. It's constantly, it's okay, you're okay. And James flies in the face of that and says, it is not okay and you are not okay. You are a sinner. Be honest about that. And at some point, spiritually, before God, you have to wipe away the facade. You have to drop the excuses and the pointing that we have been doing since Adam. Saying, it was the woman you gave me. My sin is not my fault. There's someone else. And Eve saying, it's the serpent. My sin is not my fault. And James is calling us to be honest before God and say, it is my fault. I did it. It was me. And then not only honest about sin, but serious about sin. These verses are not on many Christian greeting cards. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. We have New Hope Baptist Church or, Living Water Church, but we don't have Morning Church very much, or MOURNING Church. We so easily go with this culture of let's think positive, let's talk positively, let's laugh or joke or deflect or ignore what's really happening inside of us. And James, again, is calling us back to that. I'm going to talk about the end of that at the end. But right now, he's calling us back to put away the jokes, to put away the excuses, to put away deflection, to honestly look at our sin, to honestly look at what we've done and who we are, and to mourn over it. In the Old Testament, you heard a lot about in sackcloth and ashes. Is that familiar, that phrase? Sackcloth and ashes? Sackcloth would be like a burlap sack that they would literally clothe themselves, which I don't know how many burlap sacks you've been up close and personal with, but it's not known for its soft feel. And the idea was, I'm going to put ashes on my head, I'm going to burlap on my skin, because physically I want to reflect my sorrow before God. I want to mourn over what I have done. I want to mourn not only over what I have done, but over who I am. And James is calling us to mourn over our sin, to see the destruction, to see the pain and the death that our sin causes in ourselves and that our sin causes in the people around us. And then another phrase that he uses is, submit yourselves therefore to God. Submit yourselves to the Lord. This goes back to two Sundays ago. Take the bit and give God the reins. That idea of, God, you are in control. I'm going to submit to your control, and I'm going to let you have control over my life. You can steer the ship. You can take the bit. There's a lot of times that especially when people are caught in sin that hurts the people around them, this first part sometimes comes pretty easily. We can mourn and we can cry and we can talk about how sorry we are. We can talk about, please forgive me, I'll never do it again. I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And that's appropriate and that's necessary. It's necessary that at some point we're broken over our sin. But the second part then is to submit and to begin to make changes based on our brokenness. So look at some of those changes. He says, submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. I was trying to think in practical terms, what does it mean to resist the devil? And then it hit me, we're so good at resisting God. We know exactly what that means, right? Have you ever wanted to do this and you hear God talking to you, you hear God trying to stop you, you hear God trying to speak to you, and we resist him. We say, no, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to do that. So just flip that around. Instead of submitting to ourselves and to the devil and resisting God, submit to God and resist the devil. Tell him, no, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to do that. That's not where I'm going. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Then jump over to verse, we're going to get to draw near to God, but he says, cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. So after we're broken internally, and after we have this time of being honest, serious, and mourning over our sin, then he says, submit to the Lord and have a time where you resist the devil and you cleanse your hands and you purify your heart. Physically, set up, make changes. If you say, I'm sorry, I'm never going to do that again, and then you do all the same actions that led you to the sin the first time, guess where you're going to end up the second time? It's obvious. You cannot say, I'm sorry, God, wife, children, I'm not going to do that again, but I'm going to do all the steps that led me to that, and then somehow magically I'm going to stop this time. No, you're not. You're going to do the same thing the second time that you did the first time. Submit yourself to the Lord, take the bit, and give God the reins. And then number 3, accept God's grace and get back on mission. Look at verse 6 with me again. But he gives more grace. In Romans, Paul says, where sin abounds, what? You remember? Grace abounds much more. And I love that phrase because he's saying sin is, there's a lot of sin, but where there's a lot of sin, he says grace, it doesn't just say where sin abounds, grace abounds. And he doesn't just say where sin abounds, grace abounds more, but he says where sin abounds, grace abounds much more. That God's grace is so much more than our sin. So I saw this phrase, but God gives more grace. And I thought, I wonder what James is saying. What are the words there? So I looked up this word more, and I was just smiling from ear to ear. Do you know what this word more, God gives more grace? You know what the root word there is? This is so cool. You'll never forget this. God gives mega grace. The Greek word is mega. So James says God gives mega grace, which literally means great. And in the way he's using it, it's a comparison. God gives greater grace. That with all the sin, when we're honest about our sin and serious about our sin and actually see how filthy we are, how corrupt we are, how proud we are, then we see a God who says, my grace, mega, overdoes, is greater than all of your sin. Which was the beautiful thing back in college that I began to understand about God is I always thought God is lucky because I did this, and this. And in order for me to work or serve God, I had to have this long list of qualifications. The thing we need to serve God is one simple thing, and that is His grace. It's not about our list of qualifications. It's about I am someone who has been washed, who has been purified, who has been cleansed by God's grace. So I have God's grace. If you're a believer, you have God's grace. And what kind of grace do you have? You have mega grace. God gives mega grace. He gives greater grace. No matter how bad your sin is, God's grace is greater than it. So after we kneel and after we submit and after we mourn, God is there to give us greater grace, to exalt those who humble themselves, to lift them back up. You notice those words, draw near to God and He will draw near to you. All I can think about is the parable of the prodigal son who runs away. And it's interesting, with the shepherd, he says the shepherd goes and finds his sheep, but in that parable, he says the father stays home. The father doesn't go to the pig's farmer and redeem his son there. The father waits for the son to draw near to him. But he waits and watches for his son's return. And as soon as he sees his son, he doesn't sit on the porch and say he's going to have to come beg. He's going to have to come grovel. When his son comes home, he runs out to meet him with mega grace. Grace that is greater than his sin. Number 10, verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. We as a society and as a culture are crying out for this self-affirmation, for positive thinking, for a positive self-image. And we're being lied to, and we're lying to ourselves that the way to a healthy self-image is by ignoring your sin, making excuses, finding other people, becoming a victim, having someone else to push your guilt off of, or not to feel guilt at all. Guilt and shame are anathema in today's psychological world. And James is saying that will not give you the self-image that you're looking for. We're tearing ourselves apart because we know that we're broken, we know that we're sinful, we know that we are and we do wrong. And yet no one will allow us to confess it. No one will allow us to admit it. And James says, no, you need to be honest about it. You need to be serious about it. You need to mourn over it. You need to submit to God. But when we get on our knees and submit to God, we serve a mega grace God who lifts us back up and exalts us. The Christian life is not about groveling. It's not about constantly wearing sackcloth and ashes. It is a life of joy, and it is a life of exaltation. But the joy and the exaltation, the mourning, get this, the morning comes after the morning. See what I did there? You have to have the death to have the resurrection. You have to have the night to have the sunrise. And for us, psychologically, for our souls, we have to have confession. We have to have mourning in order to have exaltation, in order to be forgiven, and to accept and receive and love God's grace. There has to be a time that we see our sinfulness. So this morning, we're going to end by celebrating God's grace. In communion, we remember the body and the blood of Jesus Christ.